So the key type site for the Ubaid occupation in southern Mesopotamia has traditionally been Eridu. It has an extremely deep stratigraphic sequence that is occupied from very early on in the Ubaid period, sometime around 5800 BCE, well into the early dynastic period. And excavations at the site, beginning in the 1940s, found three distinct areas of Ubaid occupation. And the most interesting archaeologically, and the one that's caught the most attention for us as scholars of the Ubaid, is beneath the early dynastic ziggurat of Enki, who traditionally in ancient Mesopotamian society is viewed as he's kind of a mix between God and Loki. He's a trickster god, but he's responsible for doing a lot of the things that God does in Genesis. He creates humanity out of clay. He sparks the flood. He creates languages so people can't communicate with each other. The stories of things that happen in Genesis can all be traditionally in Sumerian religious practice be associated with Enki. But he's also the god of water through this, and so the association here at Eridu in the dynastic period as the god with the god of Enki, the founder of the first city in Sumerian legends, is important because under that temple, um, around 2500 BCE, there are successive layers, eight successive temple constructions, and the earliest is founded with the earliest occupation. In level 16, it's a small cellular room. It's about 3.5 by 3.5 meters, and what it contains is an offering table, a large central table with an altar, and inside of it are concentrations of burnt fish bones. And that's what you see kind of here. You have the central offering table and a niche in the corner with an altar where presumably something like an incense burner or a statue of the deity would have stood. And so we can kind of see this representing the earliest use of sacred space at the location for these offerings. And each successive level saw the expansion of this temple complex, but it remained in the same location. And I think this is kind of an important idea when we think about this in terms of the psychology of humanity. Places that are deemed religious tend to maintain that religious designation. Right? There's a sanctity of space in this. So even when a new religion comes in and practices or worships or conquers an area, they build their religious structures on top of that sacred space. We see this, for example, with the Spanish colonialization of the Aztec. They tear down the Pyramid Mayor in Tenochtitlan and build the Cathedral of Mexico City on top of it, out of the stones of the Aztec pyramids. Or with the Spanish conquest of Spain and the Reconquista from the Moors. They take the mosques, and quite literally in some places, they just build a cathedral in the middle of the mosque complex. So once a place has been deemed sacred, it tends to maintain that kind of designation, even over expansive periods of time with new people coming in. And that's kind of what we see at Eridu. So in level 11, the temple is expanded greatly, and we see the size becomes from about 3.5 by 3.5 to 4.5 by 12 meters, and the building is now built in a tripartite plan, and it's constructed on top of a large mud brick platform. And then by the time we get to level 7, the temple itself is huge. It's 22 by 9 meters, and we now have the construction of these niched and buttressed facades. And we have the large offering table that's opposite in a central courtyard of an extensive altar. So the offering table and the altar are the continuity, and by the time we get into the fully into the Ubaid period, this form becomes that tripartite style house. And so here you can kind of see the eight successive Ubaid temples in the construction, starting with that small square room with the altar and building through time as it slowly expanded. And then now we're built on the large platform with the niched and buttressed facade. And that platform becomes larger, and the complex it continuously expands. So what we can kind of see is the use of this sacred space, and well into the later temple, right? we still find the remains of burnt offerings of mud brick and ash, and there are ceramic censers or incense burners that are found inside of these, all kind of pointing to the central location. But one of the fascinating things about this is even though we kind of view this as an offering place for a temple, a lot of the activities, the artifacts that we still see are largely domestic in nature, in terms of producing things like textiles or stone tools, still within the space. So even though we're looking at a temple location, we may not be looking at a true division between the sacred and the domestic, or the ritual and the profane in this way. Now, the second area of excavation at Eridu was off the large mound, and here we found archaeologists recovered about 200 graves out of an estimated of 1,000 from the Ubaid complex. Now, Eridu itself, by the late Ubaid period, probably had an occupation of around 3 to 5,000 inhabitants. So we're not talking about a small agricultural community anymore. It's developed into a central city, the first city in the Mesopotamian plain, which kind of matches up well with the story from Enki and the earliest ideas of Sumerian mythology. Um, so you have this large scale cemetery, and it mostly consists of simple earthen graves, but what's found inside of them shows very little distinctions between individuals. It's mostly just pottery, with occasional bracelets and jewelry, labrettes, piercings in the lips or ears that go along with it. So simple objects of personal adornment, a, and a suite of painted pottery. Now, just to the southwest of the temple, archaeologists also found 14 levels of domestic occupation, known as the hut sounding. And we've already talked about this as similar to the layout to the marsh Arabs today in modern Iraq. But it's these small reed and mud huts that are located directly on top of alluvial deposits that overlooked a massive sweetwater lagoon that would have provided most of the food necessary to support the large city at Eridu. Now, later occupation levels tend to transition into that more traditional tripartite building. So we can see the story, the interpretation told by Pornell of a site that grows up on these marsh resources, then expands, and then built into the traditional Ubaid society is more or less matched by the evidence here at Eridu.